Quartered safe out here is George MacDonald Fraser's memoir of his experiences as a young soldier in the British Army during World War II's Burma campaign. Blending humor and stark realism, Fraser vividly recounts life on the front lines, capturing the camaraderie and harsh realities of war. Let's begin. Calcutta is still my favorite city, probably because I haven't been there since 1945, and remember it as it looked to me then, which was something like a paradise market. Nowadays, the name conjures up images of poverty, starvation, disease, and squalor, of Mother Teresa, and that fine old retired British officer who runs his own field kitchen in the slums. It wasn't much better, I dare say, when I saw it in the twilight of the Raj, but I was there on 7 days' leave, and as every holidaymaker knows, even in this enlightened age, you don't spend an eagerly awaited vacation seeking out the plague spots which exist within a mile of your hotel. Not that you had to look far for them in Calcutta. The beggars displayed their sores and hideous deformities on the main streets, you could find corpses on the station platforms, and a tram ride to Howrah would take you through slums and hovels populated by uncountable filthy multitudes who didn't so much live as swarm. One look would have convinced the most zealous reformer of the sheer impossibility of doing anything with that vast, proliferating Augean stable, and if you had been any time in India, you were hardened to it. There was something else too, which if it did not transform the second city of empire, lifted it at least a little from the depths. Everybody smiled. That may be at the root of Britain's 3-century love affair with India. Nowadays, it is taught, usually by people who never saw the Raj, that our passion for the subcontinent was mere pride of possession, arrogant satisfaction of conquest, and lust of exploitation, leavened only by a missionary zeal to improve. No doubt those feelings existed among some, but they don't account for the undying affection that so many of the island race felt for that wonderful country and its people. Nor do all its great marvels, the beauty of the land and its buildings, the endless variety of its customs and cultures, the wonder of its art and philosophy and ancient civilization, the glory of its matchless regiments. They may inspire awe, even reverence, but they don't quite explain why thousands of soldiers and merchants and administrators and traders left their hearts there, to say nothing of their mortal remains. One can babble about the magic of India and convey nothing. I can only say that when I look back at it, my lasting memory is of smiling faces, laughter in the bazaar, tiny naked children grinning as they clamored for bakshi, and it wasn't an act, for they still laughed and joked and play-acted if they didn't get it. There was a life, a spirit about India that was irrepressible, and it outweighed all the faults and miseries and cruelties and corruptions. That, I think, is why the British loved it, and some of us will never get it out of our systems, even in an age when Indian and Pakistani immigration is about as welcome in Britain as the British were in India. We must have been somewhere on the Rangoon Road when we were told that we were to go on leave, and I have only mental snapshots of the journey, the long straight highway through the Rangoon suburbs, with their pleasant bungalows and green gardens looking as though there had never been a war, the Shwedagon Pagoda gleaming in the moonlight. They said the Japanese had stripped away its gold leaf, but it still shone for me, sleeping on a marble floor under the counter of Honkers and Shankers, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank building, which was the only billet available, reading Gone with the Wind in the stifling tween decks of the troop transport, or staring overside at the flying fishes and the sinister weaving shapes of the sharks in the cobalt depths of the Bay of Bengal, running up between the chocolate and green banks of the muddy Hooghly River, driving past the imposing buildings and Victorian statuary of the great city, and the final arrival in the cool vaulted chambers of the museum, with the beds set out among the glass display cases. If a museum seems an unlikely base for a furlough, well, you may keep the Beverly Wilshire and the Hotel du Cap and the Waldorf Astoria and the Savoy and even the Grand in Rome. I have been content, more or less, in all of them, but the museum, Calcutta, is the only establishment to which I would give 6 stars and as many rosettes as you like. No doubt my view was colored by youth and the bewilderment of change. After 6 months of chlorinated water and compo, baking and freezing by turns in the dry belt, and being permanently sodden in the monsoon, feeling like a walking delicatessen for leeches and mosquitoes and ticks, and with the occasional possibility of being killed, suddenly there was the peace and unimaginable luxury of a frame and rope native bed with a real pillow, no sheets in the British Army though, beneath gently stirring punkahs, and the certainty of sleep untroubled by stags or operations or night attacks or yells of stand to. The Japanese were 500 miles away, and in their place there were bearers to keep the place tidy, dobies to launder our clothes, nurses to make and mend, and downstairs a cool and airy canteen where they'd never heard of bully stew or K rations, and the service was supervised by amazing memsibs who addressed the native staff and each other like gym mistresses, thundering encouragement across the fields of Cheltenham. They were volunteers charged with the welfare and refreshment of the troops, and by God we were going to be well fed and comfortable, or they'd know the reason why. Each man received a brand new suit of jungle green, starched and pressed, and on each, the nurses sewed the shoulder flash of the black cat arching its back, and we dug out our regimental badges and polished them and set them in our bush hats. We counted the thick wads of little blue notes, 6 months back pay, even if it's only 18 rupees a week, soon mounts up in a country where you buy and sell in tinned fish and mangoes, and I didn't need to touch my brag winnings in Lloyd's, and we beamed at each other across the table in the tide, happy knowledge that we had nothing to do for 7 days but loaf and spend time and money and gape contentedly at the real world again. From what I read in television tells me, soldiers on leave have different priorities nowadays. It was with stunned disbelief that I read that US forces in the Gulf were to receive counseling on how to relate to members of the opposite sex after a few months in the desert. The idea of GIS needing this kind of instruction must have convulsed their predecessors, and I'm sure it came as a shock to the present generation of the American military too. But it shows how the modern official mind works, and what it expects servicemen to do when they are turned loose in the fleshpots. Maybe sex is more important nowadays than it used to be. Or maybe we were a more restrained, inhibited, pious, and timid generation. But I was interested to note that 9th Section, who for months had been deprived of female society, and had remarked on the fact from time to time, showed no tendency to behave like Casanova gone berserk. They had what talent there was in the bars of Choreng-yi, danced with abandon at the service clubs, and chatted up the Wrens, Women's Auxiliary Air Force, Auxiliary Territorial Service, and nurses, and that was about it, apparently. Parker was an exception, by his own admission. It was on this leave that he contracted his umpteenth dose of Cupid's measles, and rolled off to the medical officer almost as a matter of course. Catching a social disease, incidentally, was not a military crime, but concealing it was. And it may well have been that the risk of infection was the great restrainer. There were no simple cures at that time, and that for clap was reputed to be excruciatingly painful. Syphilis, which was rumored to be incurable, was regarded much as AIDS is today. So, apart from the feeling quite widespread in my generation, that illicit sex was a bad thing, frowned on by church, school and family, there was considerable caution, and it was natural that grandmas, solemnly regarding a colored poster in the billet which showed 2 sultry houris smiling invitingly above the caption "Do you want it? We've got it," should sigh heavily and observe, well, I'd sooner have a pint anyways. The army propagandized unceasingly, with lectures, short-arm inspections, and terrifyingly explicit films. One poster, I remember, showed a statuesque blonde, surrounded by leering Japanese, with the caption, "Is this the face that loved 1,000 nips?" I wouldn't have thought that many of the light ladies of Calcutta had had the opportunity to bestow their favors on the Japanese, but there you are. Another discouragement, I should add, was that the average Indian and Eurasian prostitute was not notable for charm or beauty. I'm not trying to pretend that my military generation were any saintlier than soldiers ever are. As a harassed orderly officer in North Africa, I had to raid more brothels, endure the screaming protests of more furious harlots, and see more frustrated amorists into the paddy wagon, than I care to count, and I remember the blue and khaki queues outside the bawdy houses of the Cairo Burqa, the more impatient customers already in their shirt tails with their trousers neatly folded over their arms. Certainly, a proportion of the services behaved like demented rabbits, but I would guess they were a minority. Forster was an interesting case. On our first night in Calcutta, he spruced himself up with Lifebuoy, flourished the prophylactic kit which he had drawn from the medical officer's office, admired himself in the mirror, sketched out a program of debauchery which would have frightened Caligula, and strode forth like Ferdinand the Bull. 3 hours later, he was back, full of gloating accounts of his sexual heroics, and unaware that in the interval grandmas and I had been sitting 3 rows behind him in the Lighthouse Cinema, watching Laurel and Hardy. It sounds terribly tame, I suppose, but our chief occupations in those 7 days consisted of eating and drinking to excess, wandering in the bazaars, drinking again, going to the cinema, riding in the tram cars, or, if we felt expensive, in one of the coolie-drawn rickshaws, having yet another pint at Jimmy's Kitchen. The Bristol, where the sea captains went, and the big hotels frequented by the officers, were not for us, and best of all, simply strolling and surveying on one of the great streets of the world, Choreng-yi. No doubt if I could see it now, I'd be disillusioned, but in my memory, it makes Piccadilly and the Via Veneto and the Champs-Élysées and Rodeo Drive and Prince's Street and Broadway look like ordinary streets with undistinguished shops. Choreng-yi was one street and change alley and the Arabian Nights all in one, with a touch of Park Lane to one side where the broad Maidan with its trees and distant buildings was separated from the street itself by the clanging tramway line. The roadway was crowded with every kind of vehicle imaginable, from limousines and the famous taxis driven by bearded burly Sikhs to bicycles and horse-drawn carriages and the flying two-person tongas with their long shafts between which the lean brown tonga wallahs, naked but for loincloths, raced along, clanking their tiny bells. At speed they would leave the ground, being borne along by the impetus of the high-wheeled vehicle before hitting the tarmac again with their bare soles, covering the ground in giant strides to become airborne again. But Choreng-yi pavement, on the built-up side of the wide road, was where the excitement and enchantment were. There, it seemed, you could meet every race and type in India, and every uniform of the Allies in the Orient, beggars and generals, fakirs and merchants, memsahibs and pan-spitting layabouts, Massive native policemen with their metal-shod staves and American flyers with their hats tilted back and the inevitable pack of camels in their breast pockets, a naval officer in brilliant white with his sword on one hand and his bride on the other hurrying through a laughing crowd from their hotel, and a wild man with hair to his waist and his near-naked body smeared with paint and ashes pushing across their path as he stared ahead with empty eyes, sacred white cows with garlands ambling along, to whom you gave way, and red-capped military policemen with cold nasty expressions, to whom, being 14th Army and knowing it, you did not. I never saw anyone lying on a bed of nails on Choring-E, but I did see a snake charmer, a rope trick practitioner, and a Beale knife thrower who cut the ace of diamonds out of a playing card with 4 knives thrown simultaneously, 2 from either hand. The shops and booths and canopied stalls of the pavement would have taken a lifetime to examine, for they seemed to be packed with everything of East and West, crowded in among the larger buildings and hotels and cafes. You might pass a great pillared entrance with broad steps guarded by splendidly accoutred Sikhs standing like statues, and next to it a tiny booth dispensing chapatis and curries to a jostling pack of babus, with limbless mendicants crawling among their feet, and beyond that a bookstall where complete sets of Scott and Dickens and Hardy and Geoffrey Farnell stood shoulder to shoulder in immaculate rows with Milton and Shakespeare and Burns and Ella Wheeler Wilcox and Edgar Rice Burroughs, with a prim little Eurasian clerk at the receipt of custom, his lips moving as he solved the Times of India crossword and lashed out with his cane at any beggars who touched his stool. And then an ivory shop, where you could watch the workmen carving those amazing ball within a ball ornaments and intricately decorated tusks and perfect little Taj Mahals that would fit under a thimble, and a leather boutique that would have shamed Cordoba, where they would trace your foot on a piece of paper and build a shoe around it, all within an hour for 10 rupees, and they lasted me as many years, and the little Tiger Cinema with its wickerwork armchairs and a 20-foot colored cutout of Betty Grable in Pin-Up Girl above its marquee, and a tattooist where Wedge, the lunatic, had a cobra imprinted on his arm coiled round from wrist to elbow, with a scroll saying Mother, and the swinging doors of the Nip-In, packed to capacity with beer-soaked servicemen, and white-helmeted American military police parked outside in their jeep, swinging their truncheons and waiting and hoping, and if you turned the corner you were in Hog Market, that great clamorous emporium with its quiet corners where nothing was bought without being haggled for, and within a few minutes you had acquired, without quite understanding how, a silver cigarette case beautifully enameled with peacocks and a map of India with all the names misspelled, for another 10 chips, and a beautiful razor-edged cookery for 8 or 12, depending on who won the toss. You wore the grinning bandit of a stall holder, and a roll of silk, and had your photograph taken under a sign reading Kash of Calcutta, please to hold still, Sahib, you are moving extremely and the result will be all fuzzy and unsatisfactory, and been shaved by a squatting nappy-waller who used no lather but your own sweat and left your skin like glass. After which there was nothing for it but to rest in Ferazinis and linger over a desert sunrise, which was about a gallon of ice creams and syrups of every flavor and color. And a Turkish coffee. It was all new and exotic and dazzling to us, in those days before package traveling, when Britain was in the grip of wartime austerity. What is now commonplace was a novelty. For example, I had never had a shoe shine until Calcutta, I had never eaten a steak until we treated ourselves at Jimmy's Kitchen to a mysterious thing called a T-bone, with chips. Nor had I known the exhilaration of being massaged by an Indian barber, all across the shoulders and down the arms to the fingers, each joint of which he cracked resoundingly, and produced a feeling of well-being beyond anything I had experienced. Being eccentric, I had to hunt out the black hole of Calcutta, and found it, in Strand Road, if memory serves, a low archway just above pavement level through which you could look into the infamous dark dungeon. I wonder if the little plaque to the 23 who died inside it is still there. Knowing the Indians, I imagine it is. But sightseeing and riding in tongas and rubber-necking at the wonders of Choring-E was all very well. What I was starved of was reading, and the booksellers made enough out of me to retire. They had a simple system. You bought a book for 10 rupees and when you had read it they bought it back for 7. I have mentioned the works of Geoffrey Farnell, and I think I know why he was so available in Calcutta. Whatever his literary merits, he was the great romantic conjurer of old England, painting his word pictures of leafy lanes and bosky woods and green fields and pints of ale and rosy-cheeked milkmaids and saturnine squires and all those never things that were so far away from the heat and dust and smells of India. I went through him like a devouring flame, and counted him cheap at the price. The movies then being what television is nowadays, we spent hours in the Lighthouse and the Tiger and the other cinemas, but, and this is unusual for me, for my memory for old films is prodigious, I can give the title of only one of the dozen or so pictures I must have seen in Calcutta, and that is Chal Re Javan, March the Youth, which I went to out of sheer curiosity, never having seen an Indian movie. From its title, I imagine it must have been aimed at those supporting the Indian independence movement, but it consisted largely of winsome young females in saris riding bicycles and glancing coyly at intense young men. There were interminable shots of blossoms and lily ponds, all to the accompaniment of zithers and keening half-tone singing, and after about 10 minutes Grandmas exclaimed, "Bugger this for a lark, I'm going for another deco at Grable," and left. That is my total recall of Calcutta cinemas, Except for the item which probably displaced all the Hollywood features from my memory, and that was the newsreel which accompanied them, the first pictures to come out of Belsen concentration camp. We were not a squeamish group in 9 section. If anyone had seen War in the Raw, we had, but that newsreel left us numb. If we hadn't seen those ghastly walking skeletons and great heaps of emaciated bodies, I don't think we'd have believed it. Even now, it doesn't seem possible that human behavior could sink to such depths. Some people left the cinema, and one woman was physically sick. I stood in the foyer afterward, reflecting that if Robert Burns had seen those pictures, he would have revised his famous lines about man's inhumanity to man making countless thousands mourn, and substituted a much stronger verb. If I'd my way, said Forster, over his beer, you know what I'd do. I'd round up every bloody Hun in Germany, and I'd burn the buggers alive. Now then. This was Wade, and Stanley asked, what about women and children? The whole bloody sub-cheese, the lot. Not on, said Parker. You'd be just as bad as the bloody Nazis. Don't talk cock, retorted Forster, and produced an analogy of which I'd not have thought him capable. You telling me, if some bugger commits a murder, and I hang him for it, that I'm as bad as he is? Go on, get stuffed. This was at a time when the death penalty was not an issue, except among a few intellectuals, so the ethical point was not pursued. The practical one was, though. Women and kids didn't starve them poor buggers to death, said Nick. Nor, insisted Forster. But what about when the kids grow up? Think they'll be any better? Look at your bloody Hitler Youth, man. They're all the same. Christ, man, folks like them aren't fit to live. That's my opinion. Tell you what I'd do, said Nick. I'd hang the buggers that did it, and chop the ghoulies off all the Jerry men, and give the German women to the Russians. By God, that'd learn the bitches. Sod that, said Parker. I'm shot if I'd do them red bastards any favors. And I'd send all the kids to Australia, and never let on to them who they were, or where they came from. Stone me. What's Australia done? And what's the point? Give the kids a chance to grow up decent. Australia's a big place, and a bloody long way from Germany. Fat bloody chance they'd grow up decent. Scoffed Forster. Look, man, my old dad got blown to buggery in Flanders, lost a leg, never was any use after. Well, the bloody Jerrys started that. Aye, and when we'd laughed at 'em, we let 'em be, and what happened? Bloody Hitler happened, and the likes of them that did what you've just seen in the newsreel. And you'd give the swine another chance? They'll do it again, mark my words. I'd wipe out the bloody lot, bus. Dirty Hun bastards. He sat drumming his fingers. And I'll tell you this, Nick. They're lower than bloody Jap, the Germans. There, now. Jap's a bloody gentleman compared with that lot. Irrelevantly, for him, he added, and they call themselves Christians. Don't talk so wet, Forster, said Gramas patiently. You can't wipe out a whole country, man. Where you gonna stop, eh? You gonna kill Conrad Veidt? He meant Conrad Veidt. Conrad who? What the hell you talking about, man? Conrad Veidt, the film star. He's a Jerry. Conrad Veidt's a British subject, said Wedge, the authority. Marlene Dietrich's German, and all. Can't give Marlene to the Russians, sighed Parker. Wasted on 'em. Give her to me, Forster. I'll volunteer. I'm not talking about Conrad Veidt and Marlene bloody Dietrich, cried Forster, enraged at this levity. He's a right slimy-looking sod, mind, probably a fifth columnist. I'm talking about the Huns in Germany. Come on, man, he appealed to Parker. You've seen that film, make you spew your guts up. You gonna let them off? He stared angrily round the table. Are you? It won't be up to us, Forster, I said. Even if it was, Gramas is right, you can't wipe out a nation. At least, I don't think you can. My grasshopper mind had immediately skipped to the Picts. I wasn't sure about the Aztecs and Incas. I'd have a bloody good try, said Forster. And I tell you who else would, the Ruskies. Let them loose on Germany, by Christ, they'd sort it out. There was no support for this. Whatever the view of the Soviet Union among C.P. Snow's men of the left, there was a definite feeling at the grassroots of the British Army, or what I saw of it, that after Berlin and Tokyo, next stop Moscow would be not a bad idea. I remembered a conversation I'd heard on a bus just after war broke out, and an elderly working man saying, I told our boy, when he joined up, never mind Hitler, son, but if you meet that bugger Stalin, put a bayonet up his arse. Labour voters they might be, but for communism, few of them had any use. Forster's solution to the German problem, if I may call it that, was held by most of the section to be impractical, which is not to say that it was received unsympathetically. The spirit of revenge was strong, especially after the horrors of Belsen and the other camps were revealed, and it was realized what the Germans had been doing and why. I imagine that the Nuremberg trials, which seemed to me, even at the time, to be proceedings of doubtful wisdom, were staged to satisfy this feeling, but there may have been loftier motives. My own instinct would have been to shoot the leading Nazis out of hand, and the devil with legal forms, but I concede that that wouldn't have been as simple as it sounds. Our very discussion sounds terribly naive now, but at that time the term war criminal had not been coined, even the concept was unknown to us. After all, no one in 1945 was pursuing war criminals from the First World War, let alone the Boer War of 45 years ago, and we could not have envisaged that war crimes from our war would still be being prosecuted 45 years into the future. And the notion that the House of Commons in 1991 would be violating a vital principle of British justice by legislating to prosecute people who had committed no crime in British jurisdiction would have been laughed out of the room. Pursuit of a just feud, outside the law, would have been another matter, that we would have understood, none better. But if we had known the concept of war crimes, we would have thought of them as exclusively German and Japanese. After all, we were the winners, and it would have seemed incredible, then, that the day would ever come when a former British Prime Minister, and a Secretary General of the United Nations, which didn't exist then, would be linked to allegations of atrocities, however distant. And the thought that any of us, 9 section, could ever have had the finger pointed at us, really. Yet, having followed the Waldheim affair and the brouhaha over the Cossacks, and being aware of how fashionable perspectives, to say nothing of common sense, have changed in half a century, I am fairly sure that the section, myself included, could well be charged with war crimes if anyone wanted to take the trouble. It seems to be established that knowing of a war crime, and winking at it, is to be guilty, at least as an accessory, or by association. Of course, we survivors of 9 section are of no eminence or importance, and no one can grind a political axe by pursuing us, and they'd have a hell of a job collecting evidence at this time of day, so Nick and Grandmas and the rest of us can probably sleep in peace. But by today's standards, we're dead to rights. There was a village, no matter where, which contained a curious building, roofed but open at the sides, and its floor was about 40 feet by 20, and made of concrete. Down the length of the floor ran a central trench, also of concrete, perhaps 8 feet wide by 6 deep, rather like a very big garage inspection pit. The building was used as a prison hospital for sick and wounded Japanese, who were laid on stretchers and palliases down both sides, but not in the central trench. They were guarded, night and day, by pickets drawn from various units. I was never on guard myself, but I was in the building a couple of times, and saw the Japanese, who may have numbered anything from 20 to 50, I can't be sure. They were all in pretty poor shape. One morning, after an Indian unit had been on guard, there were no Japanese to be seen in the building, and the central trench was full of rocks. The Japanese were found underneath them, dead. They had been thrown into the trench in the night, and the rocks hurled down on them. I heard this from one of the section, in the presence of my comrades. We didn't go to the building, so I had only that man's word for it, but from what I heard later from other sources, there was no doubt his report was accurate. I know it happened, although I never saw the evidence. What had happened was a war crime, no question. So, what should I have done? Investigated, like a good non-commissioned officer? Informed my superior, and gone higher if necessary? Written to my member of parliament? It did not even cross my mind to do any of these things. I probably grimaced, remarked hard buggers, those Jawans, shrugged, and forgot about it. If I had made an issue of it with higher authority, I'd have been regarded as eccentric. I'd have regarded myself as eccentric. By the standards which I have heard applied recently to those who turned a blind eye to similar incidents, and by all the canons of popular moralists of 1991, I should have made a stir, demanded an inquiry, and not rested until the offenders were brought to book. I didn't, not because of any conscious decision on the point, or weighing of pros and cons, but simply because it didn't matter to me. It had happened, beyond repair, and I felt no dereliction of duty, military or moral, in ignoring it. I still don't. That is not to say that I condone major war crimes, or would take any but a short way with those who commit them. I know that the killing, or murder, which is what it was, of those Japanese was well beyond the civilized borderline. But being of my generation, in the year 1945, towards the end of a war of a peculiarly vicious, close-quarter kind, against an enemy who wouldn't have known the Geneva Convention if it fell on him, I never gave it a second thought. And if I had, a notion of crying for redress against the perpetrators, my own comrades in arms, Indian soldiers who had gone the mile for us, and we for them, on behalf of a pack of Japanese, would have been obnoxious, dishonorable even. To the modern mind, accustomed to hearing soldiers asked, after a terrorist has been killed in Ulster, was it necessary to open fire? Could he not have been taken prisoner? And to being bombarded with emotive phrases like shoot to kill, and being lectured about reasonable force, my attitude may seem shocking. But we did not share today's obsession with guilt, or its manic desire to find someone, preferably in uniform, to blame, or from whom to seek compensation. We were not over-worried about virtue for mere appearance's sake. We were in the business of killing Japanese, it was what we were trained for, it was our livelihood, in a very real sense. I am not justifying, but explaining, when I say those were the days when, if a selection board chairman asked, and he did, "Wouldn't you like to stick a bayonet in a German's guts, eh?" he was not expecting an answer drawn from the Sermon on the Mount. An American movie of the time, I remember, showed a Japanese plane exploding in flames, and an American air gunner, I think it was George Tobias, chortling, "Fried Jap going down." The audience chuckled, and last year a film commentator singled out the clip for a shocked comment. That was the atmosphere of the time, and it would be a bold man who said it was a wrong atmosphere for the time, however ugly it may look now. I can see that the incident I mentioned earlier, about Japanese soldiers being wakened and then shot, must seem barbaric now. Yes, they probably could have been taken prisoner, excessive force was used, and that too was probably a war crime. But they do come in different sizes, and it is possible to react with revulsion and rage to Belsen, and at the same time to regard the killing of those Japanese stretcher cases as a matter of little account. And to anyone who disputes that, I can only say, get yourself to the sharp end, against an enemy like the Japanese, encounter a similar incident, and let me know how you get on. We saw another newsreel in Calcutta, showing American troops dealing with bunkers in the Pacific. They had flamethrowers, both one-man portable jobs and the big caliber variety fired from tanks. Both were highly effective, and we saw Japanese staggering from bunkers enveloped in flame, literally burning alive. We speculated on what our reaction would have been to the issue of flamethrowers, and Sergeant Hutton's opinion was universally approved. They wouldn't get me carrying one of them bloody things. Not that I give a monkeys how many Japanese they burn, they can send the lot up in flames. But I wouldn't have 5 gallons of aviation fuel strapped to my ass. What happens if a tracer hits it? That concludes the 11th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please consider subscribing for more episodes.